Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. For the third week in a row, we're doing a Halloween-inspired Top 8. So far, we've looked at werewolves and reanimation, and this week we're doing another tribe that feels right at home this time of year, and that's spirits. All Hallows Eve is a time when spirits are supposed to return to the earth, and spirit is also another word for ghost, something we see a lot of this time of year. In this video, I will talk about the 10 spirits that have done the most in competitive Magic in all of its history. In this video, creatures that are spirits and cards that create spirit tokens were eligible. Spirits proved to be surprisingly high scoring, with a higher average score than other tribes like demons, goblins, dragons, or merfolk. Not something I really expected, but it makes sense because there are about 500 spirits in Magic's history, way more of them than any of those tribes. While we have seen a few sets with spirits, tribal and particular color pairs like Kamigawa block and both Innistrad blocks, spirits occur across all Magic's colors, and every color is represented in this list. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score these. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they've received, with a Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. Legacy and Vintage Championship events are also recorded as Pro Tour Top 8s, so let's go ahead and get started with number 10. At number 10, we have Strangleroot Geist. Geist, a word we see in a lot of Innistrad spirits, is the German word for ghost, which is pretty Halloweeny, right? Anyway, this card is pretty straightforward and is one of the few green cards with haste. A 2-mana 2-1 with haste that comes back as a 3-2 after the first time you kill it is pretty nasty, and aggro decks can really take advantage of an aggressive creature that basically demands a 2-for-1. The Geist was an excellent 2-drop for ban aggro decks and block, and in Standard it found its way into basically any creature-based deck with green in it. This included birthing pod decks that could sacrifice the Geist but not lose board presence and in fact make it even larger, and more straightforward aggro decks like mono green aggro and Gruul aggro. The Geist has never quite seen play outside of rotating formats and could potentially lose this spot next time we get a powerful spirit printed in Standard. At number 9 is Obsolete Ghost Council, who has the same number of points as the Geist, but I gave it an edge because it has more Pro Tour Top 8s. Obsolete is the head of the Orzhov Syndicate on the plane of Ravnica. A 5-mana 5-5 that drains the opponent 2 life, Obsolete comes with the added bonus of being able to move from exile and back into play to repeatedly trigger the life gain effect, while it can also attack when it comes back into play thanks to the fact that it gains haste. This provides a quick clock for the opponent and also makes Obsolete immune to board sweepers, which are predominantly sorcery speed, and any other sorcery speed removal. Obsolete was a great finisher for control decks in both block and in Standard. In block, it showed up in Esper control, and in Standard it saw play in the life-draining Aristocrats deck and in Reanimator decks, but also in a multitude of control decks. Mardu, Orzhov were the most common variants. Like the Geist, Obsolete has never made the transition to non-rotating formats. At number 8, we have Eidolon of the Great Ravel. After 2 cards that haven't seen play outside of block and Standard, we move to a card that we all encounter every time we enter a modern tournament, and that is the Eidolon of the Great Ravel. Like many spirits on the plane of Theros, the Eidolon also happens to be an enchantment, and it is a 2-mana 2-2 that punishes both players for playing cheap spells. It sounds like this would be a downside for a low-to-the-ground Redburn or aggro deck, but it is more upside, since decks of those varieties can do so much damage, and this gives you the reach you need when your opponent manages to stabilize. The Eidolon didn't see play in block, but it found a home in Standard red deck wins decks that were incredibly fast and had cheap aggressive creatures, and the Eidolon helped end a lot of games in that Standard. One of the more impressive showings was 3 Pro Tour Top 8s at Pro Tour Magic Origins in 2015. Eidolon of the Great Ravel also found its way into various modern burn decks like Naya Burn and Red-White Burn. This is pretty much the only place the Eidolon sees play in Modern, but luckily for it, Burn, especially Naya Burn these days, is a Tier 1 deck in the format, and it is never a surprise to see Eidolon of the Great Ravel in top 8 deck lists every time a Modern event comes around. The Eidolon is continuing to build its score and will very likely find itself higher on this list, provided Burn decks remain relevant in Modern. At number 7, we have a spirit that is basically never cast, and when someone has to resort to doing so, it's actually pretty hilarious, and that is Simeon's Spirit Guide. A color-shifted version of Elvish Spirit Guide, the Simeon is one of the few modern legal sources of fast mana. The Spirit Guide shows up a lot in that format and in Legacy, and helps enable combo decks to get things going a full turn earlier. Unlike the first 3 cards we have looked at, the Spirit Guide didn't see any play in block or Standard. It first saw play in the Extended format, in a combo deck built around Hypergenesis that put up a Pro Tour and Grand Prix Top 8 in the last years of the format. After Modern was created, Simeon's Spirit Guide really took off, primarily in decks like Living End, Bloom Titan, Ad Nauseam, and Grishol. During Eldrazi Winter, it found its way into Eldrazi aggro decks too, which could play Thought-Knot Seer on turn 1 with the help of the Spirit Guide. Eldrazi got banned out of Modern, but it has continued to rack up points in Ad Nauseam, Valakut, and Living End. In Legacy, it sees play in Goblin Charbelcher decks, which run as few lands as possible, so the guide gives them access to mana without lands, as well as in Painter combo decks and in Sneak and Show. Just this year, it has added 7 points to its score, and it is another card that will probably continue to climb this list, although some people are advocating for having it banned out of Modern because other sources of fast mana, like Chrome Mox, aren't legal, and if that happened, that would certainly hamper its ability to continue to climb the list. At number 6, we have a card that just recently rotated out of Standard in Spell Queller. This card was much hyped when it was spoiled. A 3-mana 2/3 flyer with Flash that could counter spells of 4 converted mana cost or less is insane, and this lived up to the hype. In Standard, it was first part of a Bant Collected Company deck, where the Queller was one of the nastier things you could hit with the powerful instant, as Collected Company was amazing with creatures with situational into the battlefield abilities, as you could grab the Queller off the top of your deck if that's what you needed. For example, if you want to counter your opponent's Collected Company, that's a lot of what happened in that format because everyone was playing it, or you could grab something else if that's what you needed. After Collected Company rotated, though, it found its way into decks with some minor spirit synergy, namely Blue-White Flash, which ran several spirits who had Flash, some of which had tribal abilities. Its rate of play decreased precipitously after the release of Kaladesh, but it found its way into a few vehicle decks before it rotated out of Standard. Luckily for the Queller, Collected Company has made the transition to Modern, and it continues to see play in that format. The Queller has a good chance to climb up this list as well. At number 5, we have another powerful spirit from our more recent trip to the plane of Innistrad, and that is Selfless Spirit. A 2-mana 2/1 flyer is a nice aggressive cost, but its sacrifice ability is what really gets it there. It can sacrifice itself and utilize an ability that is a huge problem for opponents to deal with, giving your whole team indestructible. This means that it dodges all board sweeping that doesn't exile or give -X/-X to creatures. Like Spell Queller, it was also a nice card to hit off of Collected Company, because if your opponent played a board sweeper, you could search this guy up and protect your board, and that's where he got his start in Standard, in Collected Company decks and in Blue-White Flash alongside Spell Queller. The Spirit's impact has also already been felt in Modern, where it has appeared in a ton of different decks, like Elf decks, which are notoriously weak to cards like Pyroclasm, so having a card like Selfless Spirit helps defend against that, as well as in Hate Bear decks. But the deck that it has done the most in Modern is Collected Company, where it serves the same role as it did in Standard Collected Company decks. At number 4, we have Kotaki War's Wage, which is the only Kamigawa spirit to make this list. One of the most oppressive artifact hate cards around, Kotaki has seen play in many formats where artifacts were an issue. It was originally printed in the block that came right after a famously overpowered artifact-based block, Mirrodin, and it was meant to try to curb the Affinity decks that were running amok in Standard at the time. However, Affinity was still too good before all the bans that needed to happen, and Kotaki really couldn't do much there. However, it did find its way into Extended after some of the cards that made Affinity so ridiculous were banned out of the format, and Kotaki could finally fill the role it was originally meant to fill, hating on artifacts, and it's been doing that for a long time. While primarily a sideboard card in Extended, it showed up in the sideboards of decks like Zoo and Boros Aggro. In some situations, if the metagame was supposed to be especially Affinity heavy, Kotaki found its way into the main board, such as in a Pro Tour Top 8 in a Boros Deck Wins deck at Pro Tour Los Angeles in 2005. Kotaki has also seen play in Modern, another format where Affinity is all over the place, and it's frequently in the main board there as a singleton copy. This is because Toolbox decks that ran Birthing Pod could afford to run a single copy of Kotaki and search it up if they ended up needing it. Birthing Pod eventually got banned, but it still sees play in decks that aren't quite as powerful, but still go hard with the Toolbox angle. This includes, yet again, decks running Collected Company, as well as decks running Court of Calling. It has also become a pretty standard sideboard card for Death's Shadow decks. It also sees some play in Legacy, but while it has come close, it hasn't quite managed the top 8 in that format. Like many of the creatures on this list, Kotaki isn't done yet, and indeed, of all the cards on this list, she's gained more points in 2017 than all but one card on this list, with 11. At number 3, we have the first card that doesn't actually have the type Spirit itself, and that is Marlin Hunt. Marlin Hunt is part of a cycle of powerful rare lands in the original Innistrad that had colored activated abilities. Marlin Hunt can turn creatures from your graveyard into 1/1 flying spirits. This is a pretty powerful ability to add to a land, as the cost of running this in your deck is quite low. It effectively gives you a source of extra creatures while also producing mana when you want it to do that, so it's not really taking up a slot in your deck. It saw most of its play in Standard, showing up in basically any deck that ran both of the colors it asks for. This included Illusions decks, Tempered Steel decks, Blue-White Aggro decks, and the most successful deck it saw play in, Blue-White Delver. It also saw some play in Modern, in some versions of Caw-Blade, and in Bormandos. It only saw play in Modern in 2012 though, so it isn't a card that has become a mainstay there like some of the other cards on this list. While it got out to a big lead, Marlin Hunt hasn't seen play in several years, and all 4 of the cards immediately behind it are within striking distance and still seeing play, so it could take a pretty big tumble even within the next year. At number 2, we have a super push creature, Geist of St. Raft. It's a crazy card. For 3 mana, you get a 2/2 with hexproof that makes a 4/4 flying angel every time it attacks. In some games, this effectively makes Geist a 3 mana 6/6. Geist first saw play in block, showing up in 2 top 8s at Pro Tour Avacyn Restored in 2012, 2 in Bant Aggro, and 1 in a Miracle deck. In Standard, he was such a key card that some decks were named for him, in particular Saint White Weenie decks, which were blue-white decks that basically ran blue just so they could play Geist of St. Raft. He also saw play in Bant Hexproof, a deck that ran lots of creatures with hexproof and put auras on them. Geist with auras on him is just stupid. If you've ever faced that down, you know that, and that's what those decks wanted to do. Geist didn't only see play in Standard either, he has seen a fair amount of play in Modern too, primarily in Cobblade and Delver decks. Most recently, Geist was in a top 8 deck at Grand Prix Sao Paulo earlier this year in a blue-white mid-range deck. And at number 1, we have 3 different cards. From time to time, if cards on the list are too similar and all would have made the list, I combine them all together so we can talk about a larger variety of cards in one of these videos. All 3 of these cards are white and cost 3 mana and make flying spirit tokens. Obviously, Lingering Souls is the most powerful, but the other 2 have done a lot as well. Lingering Souls is the legit number 1 on this list. It has the most points of any card that's a spirit or makes creature tokens, and Spectral Procession and Midnight Haunting, who eerily have the exact same score and same number of Pro Tour and Grand Prix top 8s, would have been tied for number 9. All 3 of these cards give you some serious card advantage since they produce multiple bodies and are only 1 card. Obviously, Lingering Souls is the most ridiculous at this because it gives you a total of 4 1/1 flyers, but Spectral Procession makes 3 for 3 mana, and Midnight Haunting makes 2 at instant speed. Let's start by talking about Midnight Haunting. After picking up a Pro Tour top 8 in block in a Miracle deck, Midnight Haunting saw play in Standard, where it primarily showed up in blue-white Delver and black-white tokens. It hasn't seen play since 2012, though. Spectral Procession saw play in block 2, showing up in Kithkin decks, in which it put up 5 Grand Prix top 8s. In Standard, it also saw play in Kithkins as well as in token decks. Procession and Midnight Haunting weren't actually in Standard at the same time, but they both put up a ton of points in tokens decks, which really isn't much of a surprise as they're excellent at making tokens. The most dominant showing it had was at Pro Tour Kyoto in 2009, where it put up 5 top 8s. In Extended, it put up 3 Pro Tour top 8s and 2 Grand Prix top 8s, all in White Weenie decks. It has also seen a bit of play in Modern and yet another version of black-white tokens. Procession has not seen much play lately though, having last put up a top 8 in 2012. And finally, we get to Lingering Souls, which blows these other 2 cards out of the water, both in terms of power and in score. 4 flyers and 1 card is nuts, and Lingering Souls has been an important card across multiple formats as a result. In Standard, it showed up in any deck that was running both white and black, with black sometimes just being splashed for the flashback cost. This included decks like Blue-White Delver, which were now splashing black for souls, black-white tokens, and Reanimator. It has seen the most play in Modern, where it has appeared in black-white tokens, Jund, which is splashing white just to play Lingering Souls, Birthing Pod, Junk, and Abzan. Despite being played a ton in Modern, it actually fell out of favor in 2016 as Abzan decks became less dominant. But it has had a great 2017 with Death Shadow decks now sideboarding it, in some cases mainboarding it. It's a good card for those decks because Death Shadow decks are pretty weak to spot removal, and Lingering Souls really is very strong against spot removal, so it gets sided in against opponents who are just killing all of your creatures. In Legacy, it has picked up top 8s in Stoneblade decks primarily. Flying tokens are a good target for powerful equipment. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. My MTG Top 10s are sponsored by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all things Magic. You can use my discount code in their store to get a 5% discount. Thanks for watching.